Hi, I'm Andre, and this is Metapunk Zero. And in this episode, I'm going to do another installment of the Psychosis Diaries, talking about what psychosis is from an experiential point of view. And that's a bit of a mouthful, and I'll try to make this video digestible, but I might go on a little bit in this one, so just be prepared. So let's get to it. So, what is psychosis? The easiest way for me to explain it to anybody who hasn't gone through it or isn't currently going through it is that psychosis is like dreaming when you're awake. Um, a doctor, a psychiatrist will tell you a different story. They will say that it's only disordered thinking or delusions, hallucinations, and that kind of thing. They'll tell you it's a brain disease or at least a brain malfunction. Um, but that really doesn't do the experience justice. That's like saying that the drama unfolding on your television set is a problem with the circuitry in the receiver. It's got nothing to do with that. What's going on is there's an unfolding narrative of what your life is about in that moment. You're looking for meaning in the psychosis experience, and you can't find it. And so it's like your brain is trying to problem solve. Your mind is trying. It's more like your mind is trying to problem solve. And so in order to do that, it kind of goes into a dreamlike state where all of this subconscious themes and archetypes and metaphors and all of this stuff just sort of erupts with a lot of intense emotions into your experience. And so it's like it's like you're having this waking dream or nightmare. It can be both of those things. And it's very hard for other people to understand it because it does involve all this dream symbolism. It makes sense from the inside. You understand why your beliefs make sense to you, and why your hallucinations aren't just hallucinations. They're your reality. You're really in that place when this is going on for you, even though other people aren't experiencing this sort of thing. And so we need to bear that in mind, right? So, like, as if you see somebody who's going through a psychosis, they're not making it up and they're not imagining it. However frightening or disturbing their presentation is, we need to understand that they're literally in a different place. They're literally experiencing something else, a different reality. And so there's all kinds of metaphorical truth, that will inform the experience. And I'm just going to kind of go through a list of things that I made here to kind of define what was in my psychosis experience. I can really only speak about my own experiences, and what little I know about other people's experiences or things that I've witnessed or things that I've read about to do with psychosis. And so there's this flooding of intense emotion, and it's usually, like in my case, there was a lot going on in my life that was, a lot of things were going wrong. I wasn't working. I hadn't been working for a long time. I did finally find a job, but it wasn't a very good job. It really was very challenging and very isolating. I was very isolated. I live alone. I don't live near family or friends who can reach me very quickly, and I didn't have a lot of social contact. I didn't have a large friend group in the city where I live for a bunch of reasons. I mean, a lot of it having to do with COVID and geography and various other things, but this sort of you know survival consciousness of trying to make ends meet, along with this isolation, really put a lot of stress on my mind. And so all of my emotions about that, all my fear and all my anger and all my upset and frustration, I had a lot of guilt from a relationship that hadn't turned out very well, and I was really kind of down on myself and really going through a depression. I'd been probably would have been defined as clinically depressed for quite some time. And then I worked at this new job for about a month, and then I had to quit because I was not in my right mind. And so there was all this emotion that came out in that, and it presented itself as like another world that was informed by all this terror, all this survival consciousness, all this anxiety, right? Um, but that can be anything, right? Like it can be the depths of all the negative emotion you can experience: rage, fear, paranoia, despair, guilt, shame, and all of that. But it can also because the psychosis can also take you to transcendent places. It can also be awe, wonder, love, and joy, and all kinds of positive emotions as well. Humor can often happen. I've had moments in psychosis where I was laughing out loud, at jokes that only I would understand, or weirdly enough that other people in psychosis seem to get, but nobody who is sort of quote unquote normal or like kind of in an ordinary state of consciousness really would understand, because there was nothing really communicated, at least not verbally, So all of these things can happen. I put myself into intense problem solving mode because I was really trying to figure out what these emotions. I was trying to figure out my life, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't figure it out because I was dependent on getting a job and all these other things that were outside of my control, and so my mind just overflowed with all this emotion and all this problem solving, and that boiled down to a breakdown because I became unable to make decisions. I would question every thought that I had about every possible choice of action that I could take because every one of them, as far as I was concerned, would have dire consequences. So I became very paranoid about my own choices. And if I did make a choice, if I did take an action, then I would immediately regret it. And there would be lots of stuff in my experience. There'd be, there were voices. I did occasionally see things visually, and I had a lot of experiences which are just downright weird because I didn't hallucinate them. Like there were solid objects and people involved, but but they were behaving in bizarre ways, right? In ways that if I were in an ordinary state of consciousness, I'd say they were crazy. There were or sorry, not crazy, but you feel crazy. You feel like when your whole world goes crazy. That's the trick. Is like when you're in psychosis, it's like the world has gone crazy around you. And you're just trying to roll with it. You're trying to make sense of it as you go, right? And so there's all these sorts of things that follow along. There was sort of an exploration of alternative frames and paradigms. I started this channel Metapunk Zero because I want to talk about philosophy. I want to talk about metaphysics, and I want to talk about science fiction. And in science fiction, you can imagine all kinds of possible worlds. Well, these things came up, and I'm a creative, imaginative person, and all of this stuff very much became real in the psychosis. It really like all kinds of things, and I won't even get into it in this video. What some of those narratives were, but they were very much real. They were real paradigms of reality, and they would be very difficult to understand for anybody who wasn't reading a story or going through a psychosis. I certainly was very hesitant to talk about this with doctors because doctors immediately, the moment you tell them about something like this, they're going to tell you that you're delusional, which isn't really doing it justice, and even if I'm on, even in the psychosis, I was aware that what I was talking about wouldn't make sense to anybody else, and I didn't want to talk about it for that reason, because I knew they would it's like that guy's nuts, and so I kept those things to myself. But I knew that there was some truth in whatever it is that I was experiencing. There was, at the very least, some metaphorical truth. There was some understanding that my subconscious was playing out these frames. My mind was giving me these themes to think about because they were the easiest metaphors to use to communicate with me. Like in a very real sense, that's kind of another aspect of it. Like psychosis is almost like the subconscious is trying to communicate. It's trying to express itself through your waking experience because it hasn't been heard. Like it's trying to be heard. Like whatever solutions you might have, or whatever lack of solutions you might have, are trying to express themselves through you. And sorry, I know this is kind of rambly, and I'm just kind of rushing through it, but there's very much an internal focus. I was very focused on my internal dialogues, and I was having dialogues. I was having full-on conversations with voices or spirits, or I don't know what they were. I don't know what to call them, but they could talk. At least I could hear them, and they had a lot to say, and a lot of it wasn't very pleasant. A lot of it wasn't very constructive. Some of it was, it's very strange, and that's why I don't know what to make of them. As an animist and a spiritual person, inclined to believe in the idea that there's more things in heaven and earth than our philosophy has dreamt of, as Shakespeare says, and that we live in a universe made of energy, and whatever that means, whatever that kind of entails. And so I'm open to the possibility that there are beings that don't have physical form. I have to consent to that as a possibility, but even as an animist, I'm really hesitant to really define that, right? Because it really is very, very much a mystery to me, and there's no way to get solid answers on that. And so I recognize the epistemic limitations of trying to understand what a disembodied voice might actually be. If it's easier to think of it this way, you can think of those things as archetypal metaphors for subconscious forces. Something like dream characters or whatever, some aspect of the subconscious trying to communicate. But that doesn't really do it justice, and none of that archetypal stuff really does any of the full experience justice, because you really are in this other world when it's happening. And so I'll just kind of continue that inner dialogues, difficulty making choices. I was very much afraid of people. I've suffered from perfectionism and social anxiety all my life, right? And so that perfectionism was really exaggerated in the psychosis, right? The difficulty making decisions. My social anxiety was also exaggerated, right? This paranoia of other people, right? So you could see these maybe as extensions of like my normal emotions, except just magnified, like to like a crazy degree, like just an unbelievable degree, to the degree where they could bend reality around me, and like at least from my perspective, and that was very strange. And I also felt intensely alone. As I said before, I was very much isolated in my living arrangements, in my circumstances, and then emotionally isolated as well. And so I felt very much alone and abandoned and neglected. And it was like I was in a dark forest. I was like a little child lost in a dark forest. I was surrounded by monsters, and people were not safe. And I will talk about that more with social anxiety and things as the Psychosis Diaries progress. I'll get more into that and talk about the reasons for it, because there are solid reasons for it. People don't get social anxiety in a vacuum. It's usually due to trauma, and I think that really brings me to the next bit that I'm going to talk about, which is that there is this massive difference between the medical model, what standard psychiatry tells you psychosis is, and what it actually is, and what it's experienced as by people who go through it. And what it obviously is, if you just look at it and think about it for 5 minutes and get your head out of a materialist point of view, you can immediately see that psychosis is a response to trauma, to emotional and relational trauma. It's like, at least in many cases, it certainly was in my case. It didn't just happen because my brain just decided to malfunction one day. It wasn't a random thing, and none of the symbolism was random either. As I said, it was the magnification of what was already going on in my subconscious, and it just sort of erupted into my experience and into this nightmare that I went through, and so I very much, have difficulty when doctors try to prescribe medication and tell me that I'm just delusional, or I was hallucinating, or they want to unpack it in order to debunk it. It's not about debunking it. It's about understanding the truth of these things from the patient's point of view, and that's a problem, because modern medicine looks at these things strictly as hardware malfunctions, and that really does a disservice to the patients. It really invalidates their experience. And the thing that I want to talk about a little bit here is that when you're in psychosis, if you're experiencing relational trauma, if you are reacting to extremely emotional circumstances, intense emotional circumstances, you are presenting with a lot of intense emotions, and a lot of other people don't want to deal with that. That's why I think it's medically easier just to say that it's a brain malfunction, is because then you don't have to get into all the nitty gritty. You don't actually have to unpack it. You don't have to get to know the person. You don't have to do anything like that. You can just catalog them as psychotic, give them medications, and then be done with it, You don't have to deal with all that intense emotion, and intense emotion is hard to deal with. It's hard to take, but we live in a culture that's terrified of those emotions, you know? And so what somebody in psychosis needs the most above anything else is they need acceptance. That's what I needed when I went through it. I had family that were well-meaning, but their understanding of things led them to the standard socially acceptable models of what you do in an emergency, and that is you take somebody to the hospital and you get them a doctor, and that's pretty much it, and you let the doctors take care of it. But that's not at all what I needed. What I needed was my family. I needed family present. I was alone, and I did not need to be isolated in a psych ward for weeks at a time, which is what happened, and where I didn't really have any contact with anybody at all, except occasionally, 5-minute conversation here and there with the doctor or with the nurse, once or twice a day, and that's it, I needed to be connected to people. I needed to feel that connection, and oddly enough, that's what they do in places where they still have strong communities. The Western world is really suffering. We are terrified of emotion, and we don't connect. We are really relationally broken in this culture, and that is what leads to things like psychosis. It leads to all kinds of other problems too, and we don't know how to deal with them. But if you live in a traditional culture, or even a culture where there's good community ties, it doesn't even have to be like a hunter-gatherer culture. Your prognosis for getting through a psychiatric like a psychosis experience is much better in the developing world. That's a statistic I got from the documentary Crazy Wise, which I highly recommend looking up, which examines the question of whether a psychosis is a brain disorder or a spiritual experience, and it's kind of, maybe you want to say that it's both, maybe, but they mention that, if you live in the developing world, your prognosis is better if you have psychosis, because there's strong community ties and people are really connected to each other, and they're much more accepting of each other, and they're accepting of differences, and they're much more open to tolerating extreme emotion. They're going to be prepared for that because emotion happens. And we live in this in the English speaking West, at least, we live in this culture that is very much staid and stately, and stiff upper lip, and keep calm and carry on, and don't make eye contact with anybody in the elevator, and don't look at anybody on the subway, like just ignore everybody around you if you don't know them, and barely talk to your neighbors, a lot of the time, and that's not good for people. And that's certainly, like being shipped off to a psych ward is not what people in psychosis really need. They really need connection, and a lot of the time they go into psychosis because they're lacking it. And so I don't know. I've just kind of rambled in this video. I think what's important also to mention is that when somebody in psychosis gets healing, when they get to the bottom of the relational issues which are causing this disturbance, it's a healing situation for everybody involved, because normally the person in psychosis is really at the epicenter of a whole bunch of dysfunctional relationships, a whole network of dysfunction. They're the canary in the coal mine that's really erupting and having this experience, but there's dysfunctional relationships all around them, even if they're isolated. And so acceptance and connection are really the beginning of what somebody in psychosis needs, and certainly what I needed. And this has been a ramble, and I hope I've shed some light on what psychosis really is and what people in psychosis need. If you ever happen to be going through it, if you can connect, then that would be a good thing. It might be really, really difficult to connect. It could be really hard to trust people, and so that's just got to kind of play out. But if you're around somebody in psychosis, and if they're a loved one, then connection and acceptance is what they need. They don't need control. People in psychosis are really sensitive to control issues, and that's another part of our culture. Our culture is rife with control issues. Everybody is in subtle and not so subtle ways trying to steer other people into various ways, right? We even make a big deal about influencing and influencers, because influencing people is seen as a virtue in this culture, and yet that translates to always trying to control people, or always trying to steer people in particular directions so they'll buy your stuff, or so that you can get what you want out of them, and that's really kind of twisted. And people in psychosis are acutely aware of that, and they're very aware of those control dynamics with regular people, and especially with doctors and nurses, and like police and anybody, any kind of emergency services, anybody that, any of these first responders that would actually be prone to dealing with somebody in psychosis when the authorities are called. Authority itself is kind of antithetical to what a person in psychosis is going through, because what that person is looking for is connection, and authority and connection do not go together, right? So, yeah, that's my little ramble about psychosis and what it is and what I experienced, and I hope it made sense. I know it was quite a kind of all over the place, because psychosis kind of is, and I'm nervous in doing this, and I'm more nervous than making a normal video, because it's kind of terrifying to admit that you've had this kind of an experience on a public forum like YouTube. But I'm doing it, and I hope some of this was useful to people. If anything, that people feel less alone. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.